Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Reactionary Expat. Thanks for coming on today, Reactionary.
Thanks for having me.
So this is in part sort of a derivative of your recent video, Christianity Cannot Save the West. So maybe for those who haven't seen it yet, if you could give a brief sketch or outline of the arc of your video.
Okay. Well, it was partly in response to the distributist, who has a channel that I quite like, but he's a traditional Catholic, and it was specifically about Catholicism. So I think a lot of the criticisms apply to Christianity in general. But the big problem with Catholicism is the Latin American problem, essentially. The so-called white European Catholics are dwindling in numbers. There aren't that many of them, and in that I'm including people in other white Western nations like Canada or Australia. The numbers are dwindling, whereas the numbers in the rest of the world, the third world, are only increasing. But I mean, there are about 639 million people in Latin America, a few hundred million in Africa who are Catholic. And the problem is that these people are not very smart, and Catholics in particular, but Christians in general, they always talk about their Christian brothers, and yet these people are essentially dead weight upon those religions. They exert an anti-civilizational force by virtue of the fact that they're not very smart and they're not very productive. So that's sort of the gist of my argument. And anyone who thinks that Christianity is somehow going to cut these people loose, I can't see that the Catholic Church is going to cut these people loose or get them under control, for that matter.
I guess there's a distinction to be made between Christianity in general and then the Catholic Church in particular. But one of the things that I see as a weakness of the analysis is that it tends to be too temporally focused. I mean, if you were living in, say, the Greek city-states, the Roman Empire, or Saxon Britain, at any point from 1000 BC to 1000 AD, everybody would have had the Germans and the Vikings as a write-off. Don't even bother trying to civilize them. They're a waste of time. They just burn down libraries. But once people like Boniface and others did convert them, now, of course, the alt-right would tend to view those people as the premier Westerners. So, I mean, if the same arguments that you're making now could have been made in 500 AD against the Scandinavians and the Germans. But looking at it 1,000 years later, we would see that would be a somewhat blinkered position.
Sure, but we don't have time on our side, and even if these people do turn out to be the equivalent to the barbarian tribes of Northern Europe, they're a different group of people. They're a different civilization. They're a different ethnic group. And if you had spoken to a Roman or a Greek in the classical world, they wouldn't have regarded barbarians as their kin, and they would have seen the collapse of what they considered to be civilization, their civilization, and they wouldn't have imagined that those people, even after the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment and so on, when a lot of classical culture was rediscovered, they wouldn't have seen that as a continuation of that. And that's assuming that we get to that outcome. If we say that these people, well, maybe they will become that way, well, how do we know? And if we're relying upon that, then I think we're already in dire straits.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, the question isn't, would Europe be Europe if it was full of Chinese? Would China be China if it was full of, Latinos? Well, of course not, but that's not really the question. I would say with the ancients, like, say, the Greeks and the Romans, the idea of what made you a civilized person as opposed to a barbarian was a bit broader than a narrowly ethnic point of view. So, for instance, like in Aristotle's The Politics, he points out that Carthage, Semitic people, had the most when he talks about the Greeks, right, outside of the Greek lands are the barbarians, to the north are the Dacians, and to the east are the Persians. But he doesn't treat Carthage as a part of the barbarians. He treats them as peers of the Greeks. And in the Roman Empire, Egypt and North Africa and Syria were considered Roman. I mean, so in that sense, the Hellenic worldview would have included them as candidates for civilized people. But you did bring up the point, I think it's an interesting one, that time is of the essence. And when we're running short on time, the 11th hour, as the alt-right likes to remind us, for the West, what do we go back to? I would sort of precisely use that 11th hour argument and say that since 1800, all attempts to provide a post-Christian consensus have failed. Trying to invent a new one in the 11th hour would be, we don't have enough time.
It could be. I mean, I'm not saying that I have any solutions here. That's sort of the rock and the hard place that I find myself caught in, because I recognize that modernity is deeply flawed, and the course that we're on now is not going to lead anywhere good. But I don't see this other thing as a way out, especially with all of this baggage. I mean, Latin America has been settled for 5 centuries, essentially, at this point, and they don't seem to be making any progress. If anything, they've actually gone backwards. You look at a country like Argentina, for instance. And so I'm not saying that I have a solution to this. It just seems like all of the possibilities are deeply flawed. Dan Dodd's just pointing that out.
Yeah, you brought up Latin America, and I think that was probably one of your strongest points in the whole video. But one thing that I would tend to maybe recommend as a way to view, as a lens to view this problem through, is if you look at, if you view the Rio Grande as this sort of dividing line between civilization and the Americas, the alt-right would tend to view the main division as a racial, right? North of the Rio Grande, it's more, until recently, and still predominantly white Anglo-Saxon stock, and south of it is a more mixed stock. But I would tend to view it as Protestant versus Catholic. Now, to sort of control for the same race, we can look at Europe, because historically after the Reformation, except for England, Northern Europe was essentially poor. Holland was a swamp, Brandenburg was a swamp, Scandinavia.
After the Reformation.
Yeah, were the great forests. But after the Reformation...
Wait a second, no, because the Dutch had a great trading empire, and they fought the British constantly in the 17th century.
No.
That was after the Reformation. The Reformation in the Netherlands ended in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War, which was actually the 80 Years' War for them. That was when they got independence from Spain. And over the next century, they became a great trading empire, and they fought. There were a number of Anglo-Dutch wars. The English eventually came out on top, but the Dutch were quite formidable for a while there.
No. I'm not saying that those nations that embraced Reformation beliefs did not become great. They did, but that's the point. If you look at the Alps as a north-south divide, you look at the pigs, right, in the European financial crisis. Not a single Protestant country in the list. Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Now, that's not to say Sweden, England, and Germany don't have existential problems right now, but they tend to be better off than if you look at the Western Europe, than those nations south of the Alps. So even if we account for that, and we account for the racial differences, I still think that, let me put it this way, we don't know what a 500-year Protestant rule of Latin America would look like. It's never happened. But I think I could be modestly optimistic and say that it would be less crime-ridden, more middle class, with less corrupt governments.
Well, it could be, but the thing about Protestant colonialism is that, certainly in the case of the British Empire, they had 2 types of colonies. They had their colonies where they just sort of ruled over the locals, but then they had their other colonies that became very successful nations, and those were predominantly settled by people from the British Isles, later elsewhere as well. And those people essentially completely eclipsed the natives. None of the other European colonial powers actually really did that model, except perhaps the French in Quebec. Everywhere else, they mixed with the locals to a fairly large degree.
Yeah, like with the Portuguese and
the Spanish. I mean,
yeah,
except perhaps Argentina and to a lesser extent Uruguay and Chile.
Well, yeah,
isn't
Argentina and Chile and like you said, Uruguay, aren't they more predominantly white stock?
They are, but they're drifting and have been drifting for some time.
Okay,
because also they get a lot of migrants from other Latin American countries, and that's dragging them down as well.
Now, when would you say that drifting began?
I don't know enough about that, to be honest. I imagine the past few decades it would have really taken force. I mean, they were never purely white, but I imagine the past few decades that process would have accelerated just because it seems to have occurred elsewhere in the world as well. I think people have become more sort of liberal and borders have become more open, I think, but I really couldn't comment too much upon it.
I guess would it be fair to phrase the problem you're bringing up as, is it possible for non-European ethnic stock to be raised to a level of civilization where they're not pathological threats to themselves and to the West?
Well, if they're outside the country, then outside Western countries, then non-Western countries are probably going to be in competition with Western countries. If they're inside Western countries, even if they're groups like East Asians, for instance, they're probably going to, in large enough numbers, they're going to form their own communities and they're going to act in their own group interests at the expense of the group interests of the people of the host nation. So I'd say generally not. I mean, in very small numbers, but we're not talking about very small numbers.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe let's maybe reframe this back to, if I understand your video correctly, what you were saying was, because Catholicism is going to be primarily a third world religion, whatever it once might have meant for the West as a Western religion and a religion that could save or protect the West. In the future, given current demographic trends, it's just not going to be in the position to be that kind of an institution that it once was. Is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, I think at some point there'll be a crisis within the Catholic Church in this regard. But I did talk about other Christian denominations, and the problem with Protestantism is that in the case of the mainline Protestant churches, such as the Church of England or the Uniting Church, any of these kinds of churches, I mean, they're far cockier than the Catholic Church. They essentially want to throw the borders open to people who will never be Anglicans, who will never be Uniting Church members, but they want to open the borders to those people. So I don't see the mainline Protestant churches as being much of a solution. If anything, I think they're going to be more of a problem. And then in terms of evangelicals, I mean, theoretically, they could take a harder line, but the trouble is that I think the appeal of something like the Catholic Church or the Church of England or any of those really old churches is that they have the weight of tradition behind them. A lot of these evangelical churches don't. And so in that sense, they're not going to save the West because they don't have this sort of weight of tradition. Now, I mean, obviously everything starts somewhere and perhaps they could eventually get to that point. But at this point, they seem too fractured. They seem to be doing their own little thing. Many of them don't even seem that serious. So I'm not really sure how they could solve the problem either.
Okay, so if we look at, when we're looking at the possible solutions for any sort of turnaround for the West, it looks, I think, like you point out, you like a lot of Dave's content and the traditionalists in general. I think we both agree that we're sort of in the 11th hour right now, and the time for experimentation is starting to run out. But I guess rather than framing it in the context of non-Westerners coming in, because I think we can all agree that we don't want to have more open immigration. Well, the question would be then, when we look at options of people that men of the West could pursue to preserve their identity into the future, the only thing that I see that could, in principle, in any sense, save the West, would be some form of Christianity. Sure, in its current form, many Christian churches are impotent, but really in its current form, the white race is impotent, and many other things are impotent. But say, for instance, someone like Millennial Lowe's isn't going to therefore say, well, because the white race is impotent, let's stop trying to reform, let's stop trying to save it. I would argue, in a similar sense, given that current forms of Christianity are clearly impotent, given what they have done for us in the past, I think it'd be a more efficient use of our energies to seek a reformation or transformation within the churches that already exist than trying to create structures that don't exist currently.
But as I said, if the numbers lie in a particular direction, those who are at the top of these organizations, they're not going to just jettison hundreds of millions of people from the Catholic Church or within Protestant churches. And the trouble is that it seems like the hierarchies of these organizations have become incredibly leftist. And it sounds like what you're talking about is a kind of reverse march through the institutions. But leftists are really attuned to this. They're very good at being entryists, and they're also very good at detecting sort of reactionary entryists. So I'm not really sure how, because I think that these systems are sort of designed to get you to jump through a sufficient number of hoops over a sufficient period of time that they weed out the people they don't want there, essentially. I mean, those who are already within the system, sure, maybe they should keep trying that. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, and I'm not saying that people should just give up their faith if they already have faith. I'm just saying that I'm not particularly optimistic upon that, about that project.
Well, I mean, but couldn't the same argument be leveled against, say, some sort of insurgent movement like Le Pen in France? The French government would even be a worse situation for ethno-nationalists. Because from what I understand, the ethno-nationalist project is to get center-right parties, at least center-right parties, that are willing to close down the borders. But there's the Freedom Party in Sweden. I don't remember the name of Le Pen's party.
The National Front. The
National Front, yeah. But that seems to be just as a difficult problem. And again, not saying that shouldn't be pursued, but...
Well, sure, but I mean, I don't believe that the solution to this is electoral politics. I'm not a particular fan of democracy, so... I guess if it works for people, it works for them, great. But I'm not optimistic about that, and I don't necessarily suggest that or recommend that as a course of action.
I guess to put it this way, do you see within the next, say, 100 years that it's possible for large parts of Europe to even avoid being part of the new caliphate in the future?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, I think that unless something very strange happens within the next generation, I'll say that to be conservative, but within, say, the next generation, 20 years, there's going to be some fairly significant strife in Europe. I think that's almost baked into the cake at this point. And I think that there's a very high likelihood that Europeans will come out of that okay. Well, there'll be a lot of collateral damage, but they'll come out the other side. Now, they won't necessarily resemble what we consider to be European now, certainly culturally. But I think there's a fair chance that they can win that civil war or that civil conflict in Europe, certainly.
Okay. Because one of the interesting things here is the position that we are in the Western Europe and in Canada and the United States. It seems it is bleak. It doesn't just seem bleak, it is bleak. But As far as a kind of spiritual revival, let's not be too quick to indicate that it can't happen. If you were to say in 1975 that Poland, Hungary, and Russia would end up going back to their religious roots, I think most people would probably laugh at us. But
not Poland. I think people would have seen that with Poland, maybe not the others, but Poland,
Hungary, and Russia, yeah. But within 40 years, now this is not to say that are Orban or Putin, are they devoutly religious men themselves? Probably not, and that doesn't really even matter. But I think what's telling, though, is that the only European countries that have the wherewithal to say no to the immigrants and no to the globalist community tend to be those European countries that have re-embraced their traditional Christian religions. Like, for instance, in 2011, Hungary wrote into its constitution that its Hungarian identity is rooted in Christianity. And in 2016, Poland... the president of Poland was at a religious ceremony where they said Christ was king of Poland.
Sure, but you could be conflating other factors here. Those countries, it could be that they lived under communism and they're sort of aware of all the silly word games that get played under totalitarian regimes, and they recognize Western liberalism as sort of the steroided up version of communism in that regard. And the other thing too, certainly in terms of resisting these sort of invasions, I mean, Russia has all sorts of really deep ethnic issues. Something like a third of the military now is now composed of Muslims, and they have large Muslim population within Russia. But in terms of Poland, they're very aware of their history, and one of the things that any Pole that you ever meet will tell you within about 5 seconds of meeting him is he'll tell you all about King Jan Sobieski III and how he essentially saved Western Europe at the Battle of Vienna in, when was that, 1683. So it could be that Eastern Europeans have acted as a buffer zone against these other civilizations for a long time. And so they're very aware of their history. Hungary was ruled essentially for about 150 years by the Ottomans. So they're very aware of that. So it could be that. I mean, it could be as you suggested, but I think there are other factors that we need to account for as well.
Oh, no, yeah. I would not deny that the 40 years of communism would be a factor. And also I would not deny that being sort of the vanguard of Europe against foreign invasion would be the case. But by the same token, Spain was occupied by the Moors for centuries and was the vanguard of the West. And they don't seem to have a similar attitude that Hungary has. So if we control for that frontier aspect, it would seem that...
Well, they've had longer, though. They've had longer to forget, in a sense, because the Reconquista ended in 1492, and then they went on to become a colonial power. So they have gone on a very different trajectory. And also, I mean, they just as Hungary and Poland and Russia and other parts of the former Warsaw Pact emerged out of communism in 1989 into 1991 in the case of the Soviet Union. Spain was ruled by a fascist dictatorship up until 1976. And then when Franco died, they sort of reacted to that, I guess. So it's sort of like they were under right-wing rule, and so they've had this sort of left-wing reaction to that. It could be that. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure why Spaniards are such raging leftists. I mean, it could just be a Western European thing at this point, and being in the EU and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, certainly it's interesting to discuss the threads that why are Poland and Hungary the way they are now. I think what's more important than how they got there is that they are here, and that if we're looking for models to go with in the future to sort of fortify the spirit of Western man, this seems to be the most, I mean, again, not to be utopian or anything, but this does seem to be the most successful contemporary mode of fortifying the Western man.
Well, but those countries also have great dysfunction, so they're heavily reliant upon the EU for subsidies. They have sub-replacement fertility levels. So replacement level is 2.1. I believe Poland is around 1.3, so it's about 2/3 of what it should be. So they have big issues, and Russia, of course, has huge issues in terms of corruption, and their economy is sort of a one-trick pony in a sense. So I mean, these I think one of the issues about when you look around the world is that I don't think that there's any sort of ideal country. I mean, maybe Switzerland or something like that, but any large-ish country tends to have its own set of problems, and there are different set of problems to its neighbors, perhaps. So Poland and Germany, they're neighbors, but they have markedly different problems, but they still, both of them have problems. Hungary has problems, right?
Oh, sure. But I would say that using like a Civil War analogy, like the Spanish Civil War, the different factions involved, all of the factions had problems, and one could in July of 1936, analysts from across the spectrum, no doubt, nitpicked the chances of any one of them winning, but ultimately, what ends up causing one side to win is they either have fewer problems at the get-go, or if they have more problems than their competitors, they're able to narrow the gap, so they end up having the fewest problems. It's like that dictum from, I think it was Clausewitz. It's not the side that wins wars, are the sides that makes the fewest mistakes.
Yeah, it could be. There's also
have none.
There are also outside forces, and also there's a certain amount of luck involved in any war also. But I mean, looking at Spain, what's Franco's legacy then? So, he ruled for 40 years. What's his legacy been there?
Oh yeah, it's gone. It's evaporated. I think maybe a better example of a right-wing dictator would be Pinochet.
Well, but I've heard that recently Chile has been going somewhat left-wing. I don't know how true that is. I mean, this seems to be a sort of a creeping problem everywhere in the world, even in parts of the world that are not Western, be they Russia or China or the Middle East or anywhere else. There's this sort of creeping problem of modernity and liberalism, progressivism, all these sort of the moral degeneracy and all these other problems of that vein. And even in those countries where they're trying to resist those things, they almost seem bound up in modernity. And if everyone gets a cell phone, then they go down that route. I don't know what that is exactly.
Sure, but yeah, certainly right now, not just the West, but the world is suffering a tremendous malaise and ennui, which is the result of modernity, and I think in relationship to that, not just the ideas of modernity, but the material products of modernity. But I think to look at it, to go back to the 36 scenario of Civil War of Spain, is yes, all the factions in 1936 that were competing had deep systemic problems, but eventually through just his own organizational genius, Franco was able to rally the right together to smash the communists, and the left really never effectively organized in that war. But let's put it this way: of the current candidates for Western solutions, I think that one can make a modest claim that Christianity in general, and if we look at Poland and Hungary, Christianity actually applied, is the best of the currently viable Western candidate possibilities. Any sort of like atheist society is going to fail. I mean, the entire Eastern Bloc shows that. I mean, well, a bunch of Germany's malaise is the result of the fact that East Germany is one of the most atheist countries in the world, and they distorted Germany's demographics when they got reunited.
Sure, but I mean, Poland also has the liberty of being an ethno-state, so we could perhaps argue that Poland's success or perceived success is because it's Polish. And I think it's just under 40 million people, and the overwhelming majority of them are Polish. There's 90-something% Polish. Hungary has some significant minorities in terms of Slovaks and I think Romanians as well. But again, it's pretty much an ethno-state. So maybe it's because they're religious, maybe it's because they're ethno-states.
Well, the one thing that I find uncompelling about the fact that Poland or even East Germany was an ethno-state is that under the Eastern Bloc, these were abject failures.
Well, sure, because they're under communism.
Yeah, but that's just the point. I mean, when that seems to indicate to me that the cultural element, whether it's Christianity or the East or communism, is a more determinative factor, or rather, it has more of an effect, even if we control for racial identity.
I mean, if you tie a lead weight to a swimmer's ankle, then it's not going to matter if he's an Olympic champion. He's still going to have problems swimming, right?
Well, yeah, that's kind of the point.
Yeah, but it could just be that once you take that off, then when people are free to be who they are, then of course they're going to succeed. And is Poland? Well, I mean, I don't think it is successful, but is it perceived to be successful? Is that the result of them being Catholic? Is it the result of them being Polish? And in either way, just being free to be who they are? Or it's probably a combination of both, I think. But you know, the West at the moment is in real trouble. But we have a control group for the West, and that's the West in the past. But again, if we look at a European country a couple of hundred years ago, well, were they successful because they were ethno-states, or were they successful because they were religious states? Well, probably both. It's hard to say, but we can't really disentangle those threads from one another.
Well, I think in the case of the Teutonic peoples, we can, because when we look at the Teutonic peoples, enter the scene roughly around 2500 BC, and from roughly 2500 BC to 1000 AD, they were essentially snow Zulus, or shall we say Sulus, and they didn't really do
not
anything.
Entirely, but yeah, I know what you're getting at, but not entirely.
And let's use, instead of using Nobel laureates, because of course at that point in time there were no Nobel laureates. But let's look at North Africa, like Carthage and Egypt, and we said, well, how many mathematicians and philosophers over that 3,500 year period did Egyptians and Carthaginians produce compared to Scandinavians and Germans? Well, they would have zero, and the Egyptians and Carthaginians would have dozens and dozens. And so by that logic, we would say, well, we should have more Egyptians and Carthaginians. I'm not saying that's convincing, but that's just, I think, the flaw.
But they're different people. They're different people now. The Egyptians in Egypt now are not even remotely the same people who were there in the time of Cleopatra, let alone in the time of Khufu or someone like that. Likewise, the people of North Africa in what Tunisia, I guess, they're not Carthaginian. They're a completely different people now.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, Egypt as a great power, the Mamelukes were a great power up until the 16th century when the Turks conquered them. So,
right, but they weren't producing the same caliber of people as they were under the classical world of the Greeks and the Romans. So it could have been the Greek and Roman civilization.
It depends. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans didn't have gunpowder.
Right, but the Mamluks didn't invent gunpowder.
No, but so the Turks did. They used it.
Well, they didn't. It came from China originally.
Well, I know, but it also was invented in Europe as well, independently.
Sure, I thought it came from.
I think Europe invented it independently, because during the 100 Years' War it was used, but that's neither here nor there. I think one of the things that I would like to get at, have you heard of Lynn White?
Maybe the name rings a bell, but I'll have to say no, simply because I don't really.
Yeah, he was a medical scholar in the 1960s, and he was a bit of an environmentalist. So he's certainly not a friend of the traditionalists or the Christians per se. But
what do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, in the sense that because he blames Christians for the rise of industrial civilization, which he sees as a bad thing. But he writes.
Okay, but that's not a slur on environmentalism generally.
No. I'm just saying that it's FYI. I'm not citing my own source, my own side. That's all it was, sort of a disclaimer.
Right, but I mean, you've got people like Tolkien, who was a staunch Catholic, and yet he was also highly critical of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And many of the early conservationists were actually right-wing, and there was a movement that was later co-opted by the left, and the people on the right were purged from it.
Sure. But his essay was Historical Roots of Ecological Crisis. He points out that when nature was considered sacred by pagan cultures, not just in Europe, but throughout the world, you had to, before you mined a mountain or chop down a tree, you had to offer sacrifices, and you had to placate the deities that lived there or the spirits that lived there to make sure that they wouldn't get back at you. And so there's this cap on civilizational development. We see throughout Eurasia this cyclical rise and fall of nations, the Minoans and then the Greeks and then the Romans. But there seems to be this ceiling that they don't get beyond. Or look at China, right? Han China is not significantly different than Song China. And that's, over a 1,500-year period. And, the Mycenaean Greeks, except maybe with some metallurgy differences, bronze versus iron, are not, different in any super significant ways than Athens during the Persian Wars. And he argues that, and I think other people would argue in the same sense, is that one of the preconditions for industrialization in modern science is the demystification of nature. And the demystification of nature really only takes place within the Christian context. And once that was in place, then it allowed for people to think in terms of exploiting nature in such a way that it would allow for the development of industrial civilization.
But didn't that demystification of nature also occur with the follow-up to that was the de-Christianization of Europe as well? I mean, that occurred primarily in the Age of Enlightenment, and that's really when the rot truly set in terms of the decline of Christianity in the West. I mean, it took a few more centuries to really play out, but that was sort of that was when the ball got rolling in that regard. So that's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
I don't think so. Again, I can't get into all the details of the Lynn White essay, but he would point out that even the cult of the saints, which sociologists often tie to animism and the old gods, are fundamentally different in that they're human, and the residency is in heaven. They're not the god of the river or the god of the trees, even though they might have some special affection for this or that river or tree. They live in heaven, and they're portable. So these old spirits of the woods, like you can read the Iliad, right? Achilles fights the river spirit because the river spirit is mad that he's apparently done something that has transgressed the rights of the river, and he beats him in combat, and because he's Achilles and whatnot. But that deity is fixed in the river. So even though you might say Latin West was mystical in a sense, it was a fundamentally different kind, in the sense that nature itself wasn't divine or mystical.
Okay, maybe, but as I said, this then set the ball rolling for what was to come. I mean, it's not like the Age of Enlightenment just came out of nowhere, and the Industrial Revolution didn't just come out of nowhere. These were all part of a continuum, and it sort of unleashed these forces on a long enough timeline. They were going to sort of destroy Christianity. It was going to eat itself.
Well, I don't think that you can necessarily tie the fact that the demystification of nature itself is what led to the Enlightenment. I think there are other metaphysical factors involved, like the embracing of nominalism, that led to that. But I mean, regardless, when we look at the accomplishments that the alt-right looks at Western Europe as having accomplished, was accomplished in a certain context, and that context was a Christian context, not a Hellenic or Norse context.
Well, some of it was Hellenic and Roman, but yeah, I mean, sure. And I haven't argued to the contrary. I had people responding under my video that Christianity has just been this sort of pox upon the West, and I said, well, and what about the music of J.S. Bach, or what about Gothic cathedrals and the literature of Dostoevsky, or this kind of stuff? Yeah, I mean, Christianity has inspired incredible things in the West, and it is central to Western civilization at this point. And I think it's sort of nonsensical to suggest that Britain could go back to having Druids. That's, yeah, sure. I don't take a really hard line in that respect. I think Christianity has been a very positive thing. I mean, it's had some negatives too, but I think it's, by and large, it was positive for Europe. And it also it was probably the only thing that held Europe together. Now, I don't know, maybe Islam wouldn't have arisen, but if Islam had still arisen and Europe had not basically been Christian, then Islam would have just picked Europe off one kingdom at a time, and we'd have a very different history at this point.
Yeah, so I think you might have already said this at the beginning of the stream, but I think it would be fair to put it this way, that what you're offering in your video is that you're not even per se offering a solution. What you're pointing out is concerns that you have with one solution that has been offered.
Sure. Yeah.
And maybe to use sort of the alt-right lingo in a very sort of black pill form.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can also see the appeal and the positive aspects to that proposed solution. I just don't think it's going to work, at least not in that form. And I mean, my channel is, I don't know, people perceive it as being black-pilled, and in a sense it is, but in another sense, I don't actually think that it is. I just see this all as part of an investigation, and the process of this investigation maybe eventually will yield something, some outcomes that are workable. It's just a lot of people perceive it as only being black-pilled. I don't know, and I'm really sympathetic to that point of view. I mean, as I said, I quite like the distributist and the channel that he has and the things that he discusses, because I think he is trying to do the same thing. I mean, he has his position is considerably more nuanced than I've outlined, but I think that he is actually trying to do something constructive, and so, I laud him for that.
Yeah. I think that one thing that I would like to see, and I think would be maybe is a more modest position, is that the alt-right's insistence that Europe can and will be saved without reference to any sort of its Christian past, I think is a deeply flawed and blinkered position, in that however you want to rate religion, and Christianity in particular, to say that it has no place or should be expunged in any effort to restore the West, I think is a deeply flawed outlook.
Well, sure, but not everyone in the alt-right even believes that. I mean, there's considerable disagreement within the alt-right on pretty much any issue, but particularly when it comes to religion. There are many people who are very religious, of different denominations, on the alt-right. I mean, you've got different Christian denominations, there are pagans, there are all sorts of things, and then there are atheists as well. And you can't get them to agree on everything, obviously. Maybe the sort of atheistic position is more common, but I wouldn't say it's the only thing by any stretch of the imagination.
Oh, well, sure, but what I will point out is this. If you look at the most influential voices, these are the kinds of people I'm talking about. The more, if not anti-Christian, ambivalent to Christian.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And they're perceived, whether rightly or wrongly, as having more power in the movement.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably true. Well, one of the things I think about the alt-right is that, I mean, there are people doing all sorts of things on the alt-right, and nobody hears from them because they're too busy doing them. They're successful in their lives, and they're just doing stuff at the ground level. So nobody really hears that much from them because they're just doing that stuff. The sort of the big public figures, they're philosophers essentially, and those guys, they're philosophers. They're not necessarily guys who go to church every weekend and have a family and do all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily remotely indicative of the average person in the alt-right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for the entire movement because, firstly, I don't think they would want me to, but secondly, because I don't think it's possible to speak of the movement in a monolithic sense. Despite what those sort of public figures, I mean, those public figures can't agree on 90% of things anyway. There are all these sort of public spats between them.
That's true.
So maybe it might just be pure coincidence that they happen to agree or be similar on that one position, because they can't agree on much else.
But I think this also sort of gets to the root of one of the weaknesses of the alt-right, is its difficulty to coalesce around and organize around a set of principles.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure it's very frustrating to a lot of people within the movement. It frustrates me at times. It's a bit like herding kittens. Everyone has their own ideas, and I think it's because there's no sort of text, like a religious text or anything like that. There's no sort of original prophet as such, and people on the alt-right have come from multiple directions. There are people who have always been right-wing. There are people who are formerly left-wing, former libertarians, all sorts of stuff. And I guess the other thing too is that, like almost everyone, the people within the alt-right are struggling with modernity. They've been immersed in it their entire lives. And so even when they think they're battling against it, they're still part of it. And part of that issue is that everyone wants to be an individual and nobody wants to be a follower. Yeah, but I don't know what the solution to that is.
No, whether I think part of the reason these big voices, rightly or wrongly, are perceived as having more influence than they do is certainly the media tends to latch onto them because either they're flamboyant or they say provocative things. And of course, that kind of media exposure, or if you run publishing houses, that's going to create the impression of more influence. And in some sense, is more influence.
But they do. I mean, they have big YouTube channels or podcasts or that sort of thing, certainly. But again, I mean, that's because of this sort of the lopsided political dynamic, in that the guy who sort of has his life together, he has too much to lose. The guy who has a family and a small business or a decent career and he's paying off a mortgage and all of this sort of stuff, that guy can't go and be involved in political activism, or he can't have a fashy podcast or this sort of thing, because if he gets doxxed, then his life is going to fall apart. So almost by definition, the people who are going to do those things, unless they have FU money, then they're going to be sort of eccentric characters. Let's sort of be charitable in that regard. They're going to be eccentric characters because the ordinary guy who just puts one foot in front of the other, he has too much to lose, so he can't go there. So it's sort of self-selecting in that regard.
I would tend to agree. But looking at what the West is going through now, what the West has gone through in the past, and how it's rallied and come around, and how it's improved itself through these trials, like the Arab invasion of Spain, the Turkish invasion of Europe, the Mongol occupation of Russia, and whatnot, and these various threats that were tremendous threats that were eventually overcome. Whatever form a restored Europe takes, which none of us, I think, can really predict with any great amount of clarity, I don't see how, given the poverty of the opposing views that have arisen in the past 200 years, that Christianity would not be a major factor in that.
I don't know. It might well be. You could very well be correct. Or, I mean, I'm not, these European nations, they might throw off these other threats, but they might be forever altered by that process. And then, in the same way that people from the past, if they were to look at Europe now, or even 100 or 200 years ago, they might find it completely unrecognizable. It might be the same with Europe in another 200 years. Maybe it'll get through its troubles, and maybe that will involve Christianity. Maybe it won't. I don't know. I mean, certainly in Christianity's infancy, if anyone had suggested that one day it would be what it eventually became in terms of power, they might have been mocked for doing so. So I don't know. Maybe it is going to be instrumental. Maybe it isn't. I really don't know.
Yeah, we're nearing the end of the hour. So, is there anything that you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Not really. Yeah,
not
really.
Well, thanks for coming on, Reactionary Expat. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.